Can everybody hear me? Okay, cool. Just waiting for folks in the back. Okay. So my name is Danielle DeRuiter-Williams. I'm originally from Michigan, but have been in California since 2008. I am starting a job in a couple weeks with the San Francisco City Planning Office. They're creating this new team of planners to engage directly with community to try and offset some of the gentrification and challenges that are arising with people being displaced to other parts of the Bay Area. So that's about to be my day job in another couple of weeks. But I also am co-founder and CEO of the Justice Collective. The Justice Collective is focused primarily on ensuring that POC consultants and allied consultants have access to opportunities to work on projects that move forward equity in the region and around the world. So we leverage that collective expertise to create change. And we'll talk more about how you can get in touch with that at the end. And then we have Elana Isaacs over here, who's actually a member of the Justice Collective and also...
Hi, everybody. I'm Elana Isaacs. I'm really excited to be here. I'm so thrilled to see so many people, and it's been a delight working with Danielle on this project. So I'm an equity and inclusion consultant. I work a lot with both nonprofits and corporate companies. And a lot of my background, this is funny, working with Danny, I do a lot of embodied learning. Another part of my background is in improv. So a lot of what I do is, there's activities, a lot of activities involved. So this is the first ever workshop where there won't be as many activities. So through the planning of this, I'm like, we need an activity. She's like, it's an hour.
I'm from the policy world.
Yeah, she's from the policy world. I'm like, it's an hour, Elana. So I'm like, okay. So actually, we're going to do one activity, which is I want you to take a minute and turn to somebody that you do not know and just introduce yourself and tell them just like one thing you like to do outside of your work. So introduce yourself to one person that you don't know.
4 times if you hear my voice.
Okay, great. So part of our frame for ally work is community building. It's getting to know each other. It's building trust. It's connecting. It's going outside of the box of these normal linear ways that we interact, right? So that's why we started that way. I want to just give a short frame for our lens around allyship. So when I thought about doing this workshop, I thought the most important thing to know as an ally, and for me as a white ally, for you men as a man in the workplace around issues around gender, et cetera, is to understand an equity framework, is to be able to articulate what's underneath the iceberg. Because I think that we're starting in the tech world to get underneath. So we're talking about diversity, we're talking about the pipeline, and Danielle's going to talk more about this. But to really understand the full frame, the history, the context of inequity, and then how to move towards equity. So as an ally, to really show up, being able to articulate that in connection with the values of your company.
And we'll show a slide in just a minute about what we mean by equity, because I know equity in the tech world means...
That's right. And I want to just let you know that today we are going to focus on race as a lens, and we are acknowledging that intersectionality, all of our identities, all of the privileges that we bring are woven through, but we're using race as a lens today.
And I'm in a presence and identity. I have some back issues. I have an invisible disability, so if I have to sit and get back up again, be good allies to me and understand I'm not being lazy. I'm just taking care of myself. So why is allyship important? So as Elana said, a lot of the conversation to this point has hinged on the pipeline. We just need to improve the pipeline. We just need to ensure that folks are interested in tech. We just need to provide them access to workshops or training or boot camps or whatever to get them engaged in tech. Just recently, as in like a week ago, no, like 2 days ago, how does this move? There we go. This article was in Forbes, and it's moving the conversation from just the pipeline into the culture. Those of you who do work in tech recognize that it's not just a pipeline issue, it's a culture issue as well. We see this in tech, we see this in business, we see this in policy, we see this all over the board. So you guys are not unique to these challenges. Because it necessarily is a culture issue and not just a pipeline issue, we can kind of look at both of those by broadening the context to this structural hierarchy. Hold on. There we go. So when we talk about barriers to entry into any particular field of study, if we talk about barriers to entry into school, barriers to entry into the medical field, whatever that looks like, it's placed within a much larger and longer context, a historical context, a present context, right? So I'm going to use the metaphor of the pipeline and explain at what points in these concentric circles and squares, we kind of see it interrelate with these larger concepts. So when we're talking about, we'll start from this larger one, this structural one. So say you have a kid from East Oakland who goes to, well, actually, let me use LA. I went to UCLA. I have a good example for that. So, go Bruins. We look at a kid from East LA, which is very similar to West Oakland, and the way that we fund our schools, right, is a structural inequity. So raise your hand if you know how we fund schools. Okay, so schools are funded by the tax base in the neighborhood in which they exist, right? So if we're talking about low-income communities, the schools in that community are necessarily under-resourced because the tax base is lower for a multitude of reasons that I can expound on in private conversation for years and years if you'd like to go there. But for these purposes, that is a structural inequity, right? So the way that we fund our schools, so our schools are under-resourced. So then how does that move down to the institutional level? So UCLA, I think the minimum or the average GPA for a kid entering into UCLA is a 4.0. That's the minimum, right? Say you go to an under-resourced school in East LA, how are you potentially going to raise above that minimum 4.0 if you don't have AP classes at your school, right? And remember, there's no affirmative action in the state of California, so there's actually no way for them to consider the larger context and admissions, right? So your school does not have access to AP classes. It barely has access to regular classes or books. How are you going to then compete to get into a place like UCLA, right? I mean, save Stanford. Like, there's no way you're going to get into Stanford. You might. Some people do. Some people make it in there. But by and large, it's going to prevent. That's where the pipeline narrows at the institutional level, is with how we resource our schools and the impact that has on students who are going through those schools. So then we bring it down another level. So we've got this larger structure that teaches us that our communities are not worthy of resources. We then see that UCLA is not a place where we can go, okay? And simultaneously, we're receiving messages when we're at school where we have, like, POC youth being expelled at rates much higher than their white counterparts. So you're then having an interpersonal reaction with your teachers that teaches you that you are also not supposed to be there. You're not supposed to excel. You can't even be in the classroom at the age of 6 and get out of line without being expelled, right? So then you receive all these messages over the course of time. You internalize those messages. So by the time folks are saying, well, we just need to expose Black kids to coding, they've already grown up and existed in this much larger context that has been their only reality. So exposure can only go so far. And then, by the grace of the universe, they do get into a tech company, and they don't have the same mannerisms that everyone else there does because of where they grew up and where they're from. And then they have these interpersonal experiences with folks who don't relate to them, might not understand them, depending on their proximity to what that comfort level is, if they're able to get it. But oftentimes your network is the people that you grow up with, the people that you're around. So that's another barrier to entry, right? So that's where we root this understanding of allyship and equity, is in this notion that it's not just, hey, you decided not to hire me. It's that I had to jump over how many hurdles to even get here for you to then hire me. And even if you do hire me, I might not want to stay, because every day I go and I have to experience these interpersonal reactions that are demoralizing, that are they're angering, you know, like they're frustrating, they're saddening, they're whatever. And again, this framework can be applied to a multitude of identities, not just race, but this is the framework that we're using, right?
So we've been talking about equity, and raise your hand if you've seen this. I'm wondering if this has been going around. Okay, so for those of you who haven't, so we work in an equity framework because when we talk about equality, it's like, okay, we'll just give everybody the same opportunities, right? And everything will be fine. So going to the pipeline, so that's often opportunity without equity. And we realize not everybody's starting at the same starting line. So that equity really looks at where people have been systematically disenfranchised, marginalized, and really looks to solve that at these higher levels. So that when we're talking about this culture of your company, we're talking about these interpersonal interactions, it's helped so much to understand an equity framework, because we are fitting it into, we are able to talk about it in a way that brings it to the larger framework of your company's values, and hopefully their values. So, implicit bias. So, what Danny was talking about, the ways that these things show up, and a lot of you are familiar with these and you've experienced them. And then I would say all of us have implicit bias. And there's a lot of neuroscience and research now that's really studying the brain, that many of these behaviors, things that I do, they're on the unconscious level. So my intentions are fabulous. I want to show up as an ally. I want to, I'm on the diversity committee. I want to do what I can. And yet I have these biases that are, it's like we're all inundated with them as children, and they get in there, and then we don't even know we have them. So
yeah, just as the kid at the center of that circle in East LA grew up in a culture that reinforced these messages, we've all seen those messages as well about certain groups of folks, right? To a way that, again, it's unconscious. You don't even recognize that you're making that categorization of people when you're engaging with folks.
So what this does for me as an ally is to take it off the personal and realize that I've got these, these are culturally embedded, and that even though it's not my fault, I get to notice them, become more aware of them, and that actually starts to change the neurobiology is understanding that I have these and that everyone does.
And I think to that point, recognizing that, it's work, right? And we'll get to that in a little bit of what a more robust definition looks like, but this is an ongoing process. And we just wanted to present this definition because I think this is where we often see it show up within the workplace or in our interpersonal relationships as a whole, is that there will be small little interactions that are drawn from these implicit biases that we don't recognize that we have, and boom, have impact on this person, which has an impact on the larger culture, right? You may not be hypersensitive to them. You might not recognize when you're doing them. You might not recognize when, well, you'll probably recognize when they're done to you. I just had one of those happen to me yesterday. But it is something that snowballs. It's a snowballing effect. So every instance of a microaggression, can everyone in the back see that, or should we read it? Okay.
Thank you.
I'll read implicit bias also. So implicit bias are the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases, which encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments, are activated involuntarily and without an individual's awareness or intentional control. And then microaggressions are the everyday verbal, nonverbal, and environmental slights, snubs, or insults, whether intentional or unintentional, which communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative messages to target persons based solely upon their marginalized group membership.
And I think one of the keys here is whether intentional or unintentional.
Are you also making them available online or after the...
Are you going to put the slides up, Luce? Or do the slides go up?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
we'll put them on the Justice Collective website too. You can download them there too.
Okay.
I don't know if any of you saw, so I was in an Al Jazeera video, and it was about racism, and is racism worse now than it was generations ago? And when I went in for the initial interview, they had a whole general bunch of questions about racism, and one of the questions they asked me was, how often do you experience racism? And I said, every day. And they're like, well, what do you mean? And I'm like, when I drive down the 580 in Oakland and the hills are protected from all the truck exhaust, but folks in the who are on the 880 corridor are not protected from that exhaust, that's racism, right? When I'm standing in line at the coffee shop and I hear the two gentlemen behind me refer to West Oakland as Sketchtown, that's racism, right? So it's an everyday kind of thing. So when you're an ally, it's your responsibility to recognize that this context in which we are all existing is one that traumatizes marginalized groups at a rate significantly higher than every other person, right? And so when people are exhausted and don't necessarily want to explain to you why this was an issue for them, it's because they went through their whole day. They drove down the 880 and recognized that. They stood in line for coffee and had to overhear their neighborhood referred to as that, right?
But I don't see color. I just see people.
I really just want to start a fresh world where, we're just all one people. There's no racism anymore. The more we talk about it, the harder it is to get past it.
I just feel like we're in a melting pot, and we just need to sort of start over, start fresh. You know what I mean? And just sort of that history is a long time ago, and how do we just all come together now?
Well, and I'm the CEO of this company, and I just want the best. I want the best. I want the person from Stanford. Even though we're making an app that people of color are consuming at a much higher percentage than everybody else, I just want the best because only Stanford produces the best.
So this is from a website called Everyday Feminism that I find has a lot of really accessible, sort of easy to understand articles around a lot of this stuff. So there's 7 ways in which color blindness is actually a pretty dangerous conceptual framework. Number 1, color blindness invalidates people's identities. 2, color blindness invalidates racist experiences. 3, it narrows white Americans' understanding of the world and leads to disconnection. 4, color blindness equates color with something negative. 5, color blindness hinders tracking racial inequities and disparities.
Sorry.
It's okay. Color blindness is disingenuous, and colorblind ideology is a form of racism. So that's kind of pretty potent. We could go on and on and on about that. Did you want to say anything else about it, or just move on?
Well, I mean, so the next slide, if we can't discuss the problem, how can we ever solve it, right? If we can't be really honest about the existence of racism, how are we ever going to move past it? And I think that's central to what allyship looks like. How we ally is an acknowledgement is step 1, right?
Intent versus impact. So, as you can see, if you are driving in your car and you accidentally hit a pedestrian, you did not mean to hit the pedestrian. When you get out of the car, your main thing is not, oh my God, I didn't mean to, I didn't mean to, I didn't mean to do that, I didn't mean to do that. And explaining how that happened. Probably your first course of action is to see if the person is okay and see the impact of what just happened. I don't know if that's a good example because often people are just really concerned about insurance and stuff.
What is California?
As I'm saying this. But let's take something simpler, stepping on someone's toe. Right? If I step on Danny's toe, if I didn't mean to, chances are I'm not going to get super defensive about that I didn't mean to step on her toe. There was an impact, nevertheless. This, personally, if you walked away, and some of you are familiar with this, but for those of you who aren't, if you walked away with one thing from this workshop, for me, it would be this. Because yes, you didn't mean to. 99% of the time, you didn't mean to. But that does not change the impact on the other person. So this is really a crucial concept for me as an ally. Because when someone calls me on something or says, hey, that really hurt, or in that meeting, and for me, an example would be, I'm an extrovert and I'm a leader, and in meetings I talk a lot and I'm really out there, and I might be stepping on people's toes. That is not my intention. I might be taking up a lot of space. I am a white woman, right? So those two things going together, yes, I'm a woman, but if I'm in a meeting with a lot of people of color and I'm taking up all the room and all the space, it's not my intention. It's not my intention to take up all the space, but just being aware of the space I'm taking up and maybe stepping back a little. So there's just all these ways in which my being willing to look at my impact versus my intent and being humble about that is a crucial thing about being an ally.
So does anybody here talk to their mom every day? Like, raise your hand. So I talk to my mom every day. I'm an only child. I'm her best friend. I have other best friends, but I'm her best friend. And as such, and I think this will resonate with most people, I'll call her and I'll be like, hey, I had a really bad day, and I'll give her like the 5 reasons why I had a bad day. And then instead of like just being like, oh, babe, that's like sad that you had a bad day, she like gives me like 17 ways that I should or could have made it a better day. And I'm like, damn, I just wanted you to listen and hear. This is why she's not my best friend. This is why she's my mom. But I just wanted her to listen, right? So her intention was to make me feel better by solving the problem, right? That wasn't her impact. Her impact was I didn't feel heard, I didn't feel encouraged, I felt as if I didn't get what I needed from the conversation. And that's a similar kind of interaction that allies might experience, in someone coming and saying, hey, man, that was a really rough meeting, and this is what's coming up for me in this meeting. And instead of being like, well, let's just launch into action, and we're gonna go talk to so-and-so, and we're gonna do this, right? That might not be the immediate thing that the person needs. They're actually inviting you to ask them what they need, right? So if your first inclination is to like solve the problem, don't, right? Your first inclination should be to listen and then ask them how you can help, okay?
So, cognitive dissonance. I am a good person. You're all good people. How do I hold that with the and of? And if you take any identity, so for me as a white person, for you as a man, for you as an able-bodied person, for you as a straight person, I have benefited and continue to benefit from history and structures that hurt and disadvantage people of color, women, disabled folks, GLBTQ folks, systematically and daily. What happens when I try to hold these two things at once? Cognitive dissonance. I'm a good person, and so we have a visual at what often happens. Is there the next slide?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. That went fast.
It's not me, it's the clicker.
So I'd love to hear from you a few words either having been on the receiving end or the receiving end of trying to tell someone something and them having this reaction, or having done it yourself. So starting off, defensiveness. Any other ways that you see this manifesting? When you try to call someone on something, when you point something out, when it's been pointed out to you. Yep.
So I got, oh, come on.
So not believing the person.
Or
Yeah.
we're overreacting.
You're overreacting.
Right there?
Gaslighting, what does that mean?
Oh, it means making the person feel like they're crazy for thinking that this is offensive.
Making a person feel like they're crazy that you thought something was offensive.
Facebook interactions count too, because that's, like I said, I'm from Michigan. My Facebook is a mess.
Yeah.
Rejection.
Say more.
You're offensive too.
Right. Turning it right back. Okay. A video that I love to show. How many of you have seen? Has anyone seen Amar Rahman's video on reverse racism? Really powerful. Wanted to show it. I highly suggest. But he basically does a comedy bit on why reverse racism isn't a thing. And the reason it's not a thing is going back to these structural, institutional, these huge, the context, right? It's all context. So you can have prejudice across those lines, but it's not backed up by these huge structures and institutions. Okay.
I can't be racist, sexist, whatever, because I belong to other marginalized groups, so clearly I understand.
So yes, using intersectionality to deny your part or your privilege. So yes, there's places where each one of us has not privilege, right? But there's some that we do. So instead of throwing back, but I'm, all these things, realizing, okay, maybe this is a situation where maybe I am coming to this with some more privilege or not knowing. Yeah.
I'm going to go to him, and then that'll be the last one.
I would say kind of overcompensating, but in a deflecting sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
You might get a reaction like, oh, maybe they actually understand what you're saying, but then the next couple of weeks, they are really saccharine to you.
Or making it really personal, like, oh my God, I'm such a terrible person. I can't believe I did that. It's like
Bringing it back to them,
about you,
right?
Right.
Okay.
Last one, and then.
I was going to say accepting that you are racist, but then not thinking it's a problem.
It's just
Everyone's a little racist, right?
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So almost using, this is interesting, I noticed this happening, using implicit bias as an excuse. Like, we all grew up in this society. Oh, well. Yep.
So allying, we've now changed it into a verb. Allying, say that 6 times fast, and then you get an A for today, in 2015 and beyond. So allyship is not an identity. It's a lifelong process, and that's what I meant earlier about it's something that we continue to iterate on. You never are done learning how to be an ally. So I'm half white, my mom is white, and I said something really profound at 16, which I'm a long way from 16 at this point, and like she kind of thought she had it figured out at that point. Like a year ago, I had to be like, they've created new kinds of racism since I was 16, right? Like 9/11 happened. There's like new ways to be racist. So you have to keep learning this process. And you having given birth to a black child doesn't mean that you by osmosis or whatever scientific, the placenta didn't teach you, whatever.
Educational placentas.
Exactly, you have to keep working on it and learning it. And those conversations are painful, especially when they're with people that are close to you. And I think, I imagine a lot of you work in kind of small teams and startups, and I'm familiar with that experience, and the folks that you work with become like your family, right? And you don't want to have hurt them, and you want to really honor that relationship. So the recognition that sometimes it's painful, the butting heads, but it's something that you can, continue to move past. And it's based on building trust and consistency. Again, this is this constant checking, iterating on it, and accountability. So it assumes a certain level of trust that then allows you to say, hey, this is how I felt when that happened. Or, yo, when you said that, that really hurt me in this way. Or that's offensive. Being able to hold each other accountable and not getting defensive about it is a big piece of allying.
And so going back to our structure, we're talking now on the interpersonal level, but creating that kind of culture, the reason those are concentric circles is that any work you do on the personal, on the internalized, on the, as an ally looking at your stuff, is going to then feed your ability to show up, to be part of creating a culture on an institutional level. So it's not enough to just, okay, well, I went to this conference, Othering and Belonging, and there's a wonderful scholar named John Powell who does a lot of work around this. And at the end of the conference, he said, all right, if you're walking away from this conference thinking, all right, my work is on the interpersonal level, he said, you actually didn't get what you were supposed to get from this conference, because all of us get to really look at it on all levels, right? So that the interpersonal work is in service of how can I show up better for creating a more inclusive culture in my company. And then hopefully there's a team built around that. So starting from the ground up, but if you're in a leadership role, it can come from that way too, but seeing this as a microcosm that then can start to grow and influence.
Yeah, and I think we can all recognize in our larger kind of culture in the U.S., like now the institution, although there's tons of inequity still built into it, but we can just take like slavery, right? Oh yeah, slavery is illegal now. No one can be owned. There are still people who believe that we should have slaves, right? Like, so the point is that it's both a groundswell and a top-down. No amount of creating institutions is going to really mean anything when we still have interpersonal examples of the ways in which we continue to perpetuate these inequities, right? So I think this is an important point. And this goes back to kind of this recognition that, privilege, what privilege does mean, I know that word gets thrown around a lot, and I know folks' immediate response then is to get defensive. When you say privilege, folks are immediately shut down. Well, my family was poor when I grew up, and there's, I'm really waiting for my, white man check to come through. Someone said that on a Facebook post the other day. He's like, I'm really waiting for my white man privilege check to come in the mail, and I'm like, that's not how it works, right? And I'm waiting for mine too, but it's called reparations. It's the recognition that privilege is a special right, an advantage, or an immunity, that's a big one, granted or available to a particular group, but it does not mean that you're a bad person, because that's immediately oftentimes what follows. Either what follows is, well, I've had this kind of lack of privilege in this area, and I'm not a bad person, so there's no way that I could be perpetuating these things because I'm a good person. Only like KKK racists are the ones who, or like Kim Davis, who, they're the problem, right? She is a problem, but.
So this moves well into, do we want to show this? Do we have time? What's our time like?
No.
Oh, crap.
You should watch this documentary. It's fantastic.
So this is called Cracking the Codes, and a woman named Dr. Shakti Butler, who's Oakland-based. It's called World Trust is her organization. And they put out films, and they're all really great. They can be used for educational purposes. And this video, just in short, is about how to use your privilege for good, basically. That when you're aware, it takes place in a grocery store, and I won't go through it, but really suggest watching it.
It's really powerful. So those of you who seek out allyship, either kind of intentionally or just through your relationships, what are some ways that you would want folks to be allies to you? And we have examples, but what does it take? How do we act as an ally?
How do we ally?
How do we ally?
Yeah.
Assume that you are part of the problem and that you do need to be part of the solution.
Can everybody hear? Assume you're part of the problem and you get to be part of the solution, that it's both. Yeah.
I think that assuming that you don't know the whole context that someone else is living in.
Assuming you don't know the whole context someone else is living in. Sometimes
said
shutting
shutting
up.
up.
Cannot over.
But not shutting down,
yeah,
right? But not
yeah.
shutting down, shutting up with an openness, right? Yeah.
It says being willing to educate yourself. That might be research or it might be just talking to people that are good.
Thank you. So this is a huge, huge, huge point, is that we often expect those, and Danny referred to this before,
Look,
those who are experiencing microaggressions on a daily basis to educate us. And we come with good intention and we say, please tell me what I can do, right? Putting all the onus on them. So educating yourself of your part of whatever inequity, whatever form of oppression you get the long end of the stick on. Yep.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, like, my personal tolerance for educating grown people about what they can find on the internet and in books is really low at this juncture in my life. I wasn't born with an analysis around race. I was born a person of color in a country where I am have a lot of disadvantages, right? But like, I did go to school. I got some degrees that taught me about it. I read lots of things. There are amazing people who are much smarter than me who talk about this stuff all the time. But again, I'll send you a reading list, but I'm not necessarily, unless you're someone that I have a close personal relationship with, don't expect everyone to give you a master's level understanding of the history of race and class in this culture. It's not their responsibility to do so. You can enroll in a Udemy course for that.
Race and class for dummies.
Exactly. So allyship requires us to act with honesty. Some of these were already said. Vulnerability, right? Adaptability. So what worked in one situation might not work in another situation. What worked the first time might not work the second time. You gotta level it up. I keep pushing my mom, like, okay, now you get that part. Let's have you read this book now. Let's talk about the analysis at a deeper level now that you've got that. Persistence. So you have to constantly do it, right? Just like I have to constantly be a black woman in America, you have to constantly be an ally. Solidarity. Fearlessness, right? Scary. I have a friend right now, she's Mormon, she's white, and she's like hitting her head against the wall trying to educate her parent-in-laws about like racism, and she's having to be really fearless about how that might affect their relationships, but to her it's important enough, right? And discomfort.
I want to underline this one. Yeah. So this requires your building tolerance and capacity to feel uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable. These conversations are. That does not mean they're bad or wrong. This, particularly in work culture, I understand is a pretty challenging thing. Perhaps particularly in the tech world. But I take that back. I think they're uncomfortable everywhere. I think every place has its own flavor. So building your capacity to feel, to move into the discomfort and know that it's all worthwhile in the end.
Has everyone here
talk about
felt
why
these
in a second.
emotions before?
Yeah.
Raise your hand if you felt any of these emotions before. Did you live? You're still with us, right? You're still here, you're full-bodied, hopefully, right? And self-reflection is the final one. So this is actually kind of where we want to tie this all back to. So why is diversity important? Why is allyship by extension then important? And not only is it aligned with like the right thing to do and what we should strive for as you know, people who care about those who are around us and the people who care about humanity at whole, but it is also aligned with a lot of our mission and vision within the tech world, within really every field, right? So this is Microsoft's statement on kind of diversity and inclusion. And it's really good for your bottom line, as all of you know. It allows for greater innovation. It allows for better sustainability when it comes to your companies because you're able to meet markets that you might not necessarily recognize because you're coming from one perspective and everybody else.
So that this issue, going back to the pipeline, going back to the structure, that if we apply an equity framework to thinking about allyship, and when these conversations are happening in your companies, on your teams, if you can start talking with an equity framework and bring it back to the values of your company, and ultimately which are connected to the ROI, which are connected to global marketplaces, which are connected to, this whole conference is about inclusion, but it's also, you're talking about retention, you're talking about recruitment. All of these issues, if you can look through an equity framework, it's going to not just be on the surface of the problem. It's going to be able to shift the conversation, which we know is shifting. It is starting to shift. Shift the conversation to something much more sustainable, real, that welcomes everyone in the room, truly, that is about retention, because you're looking at office culture and you're looking at your part, not just, what do we need to do to blah, 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 right? Surface issue. What do we need to do to get more people of color on this team? What do we need to do to get more women on this team? Surface, tip of the iceberg, right? So how do we really apply this equity framework to have these conversations as allies?
And how do we invite people to bring their whole selves to work? To not have to shift to some sort of homogeneous idea of what it means to be professional, what it means to be, right? If we want you for the diverse perspective, for the unique perspective you're bringing into our space, then we want you to bring your whole self. We want to invite you to bring your whole self, right? But you're not going to do that if you don't trust to be received in that way.
Open for questions?
Yeah, questions. There, and then in the back.
Thanks. My name's Jeff. I work at Council, but this is kind of something I've seen at a bunch of companies. So the last startup I was at, there were no women engineers. And they really wanted to hire the first women engineer, but then the question becomes, how do you communicate to that person that they will be valued and that they will be like a part of it and then they won't just feel alone? And the same thing, at Council, there are some categories where we'd like to have more people that way. And I guess I just feel concerned that we'll hire somebody on and then have trouble communicating that, like, we want to support you without that also feeling exclusionary in and of itself.
I think that's an absolutely brilliant question to be asking, and to be asking it at the group, at the team level. And I'm curious if if your team's talked about doing some training, bringing in. Now, consultants can't solve everything. we do the best we can do. But I think taking that seriously, also doing an equity assessment is another tool. You can talk to me after around some assessment tools. So things like that, where you really are looking at what is the culture. Now, you can't wait until you have everything perfect till you bring people on, right? But what are you in the conversation? Are you looking at what kind of environment this is? Are you talking about it?
Well, and I think saying it and then backing it up with your actions, right? So if that means matching someone with someone who can be their ally, or identifying mentorship maybe outside of, mentorship has been such an important aspect of my growth as a professional, especially a professional of color in places where there aren't a lot of women of color, people of color, right? I'm in policy, everybody is. So identifying or asking them if they have a mentor that you can kind of, you can triangulate and make sure that they have the support that they need, right?
So just one last thing. So if you reach out to somebody so you've hired somebody who's, clearly part of a group where they might feel excluded, and you reach out to them and say, hey, here's these support resources. I mean, is that something that you think will be received well, or does that kind of start a process of, kind of stigmatizing and setting that person aside just as they're starting, saying, we recognize that you're not, you're going to be uncomfortable here. I wonder about that
I
dynamic.
think starting from the trust building first. No, I think that's a good point, right? So it's building a rapport first, and then being able to broach that conversation, right? I think standardizing it so that everybody, because again, this is something that we need to remember, and we can break apart from the whole race gender thing, but folks might have invisible disabilities that you're not aware of. So I think codifying in your onboarding process something that states your commitment to diversity and equity in any way that and inclusion in any way that it shows up is really important, because there are folks who, I just read a Facebook post yesterday, it was like, assume I am, right? Assume I am what you don't know that I'm not, right? So just assume that I have a disability, assume that I'm queer, assume that and treat me as such, and do that for everybody across the board. And then because you're opening the door to that conversation, once the trust and the rapport is built, then you can deepen that conversation if they ask for it. Some people might not need it, others might, right?
And that's going back to the cartoon, right? The equity. Not everybody needs the same thing.
So the guy behind the hat, the woman back there, you, and we might have to say that.
I want to say thank you. Some of the stuff you've explained are things I've experienced as a person of color. What I've come to find working for a lot of top tech companies in Silicon Valley is there's less of a problem with white male and females understanding people of color than actually people of color understanding people of color. So what I'm saying is Silicon Valley has a lot of immigrants who come from countries where there are no other people that don't look like them, both Asians, Eastern Europeans.
Yeah.
I wonder how much you guys have looked at the differences in, say, implicit bias among white Americans who obviously have a lot of experience dealing with people that are different, and people who are coming from countries, first generation immigrants coming from countries where they have not experienced people of. I've had a South Asian say, I've never seen a black smart person before. So, and also, just to go back to what you said, it's important for allies to understand these differences. So you need to educate everybody, not only white folks on your team, but I know Africans who have implicit biases against black Africans. So, black Americans. So what I'm saying is, don't just assume because this guy is black, he doesn't need to be educated as well. He may be coming from a background that is different from someone from East Oakland, and needs to also. So as an ally, don't only focus on people that look like you, but everybody on the team could need to be also educated on the importance of diversity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really important point.
I want to thank you. This is a great session. I'm a community builder, and I believe our obsession with disruptive innovation needs to be more than balanced with bridging innovation. And anything good I've ever done about inclusion are the same steps for innovation. And so the fact that you're talking about culture, I love that. We're not just a victim of our culture, we're a participant in changing it. But when you use pipeline, I guess I get curious, because the world I come from, all the good stuff comes from doing with, not doing for. And pipeline seems to reinforce this career journey line. It's like, well, I came in through this way. I came in through this kind of education. I'm going to reach down and mentor that person through the same path I did. I'm not hearing a lot at this conference yet about how we're reinventing the different ways in for the people who are going to be the 1 in 11% who have a graduate degree.
Yes. Absolutely. The session that was before was about getting, so again, I live in Oakland, if you haven't gathered yet. I never come over here, so you're welcome. No. There's a lot of innovation in communities of color in Oakland right now. There's a lot of social entrepreneurship that's cropping up. Impact Hub Oakland, everyone who's incubated there, Hack the Hood back there, I don't know where she went. There's a lot of innovation because we're recognizing that if you're not gonna hire us, then we'll just create our own thing, right? So I think outside of just widening the pipeline, I think also creating opportunities where folks can do it a different way, which is gonna take some kind of allyship and diversity inclusion training at the VC level, at the funding level, at the whatever level, and people are talking about access to seed funding and how that's such a barrier to companies of color because the network isn't there, because the whatever, they can't even get to the second round or the third round and be viable, right? So it's creating space for folks to enter in other ways as well. I'm getting the
Fortunately, we're out of time.
Sorry. You can come up and we'll answer questions.
We'll be at lunch. Thank you so much, everyone.